Square Enix, or Squaresoft as it was once known to oldies like me, have been turning it out in the JRPG game for a long time and have produced some of my favourite games ever made. But there's always one that I try to bring up in conversation in particular that's always stood out to me. It's not a Final Fantasy, well, kind of. It's not a Dragon Quest, and somehow, despite the fact that I've been in the JRPG circuit for literal decades, I never get to talk about this game to people because the vast majority have never played it. Now, I decided to re-explore this game fairly recently, having not played it for a good few years, and have reaffirmed that it is indeed the best JRPG that you've never played. That game is Vagrant Story. Released back in the year 2000, I was 12 years old at the time. Vagrant Story was written and produced by the dream team that created Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Ogre, and Final Fantasy XII, with Yasumi Matsuno as lead writer, Akihiko Yoshida as lead artist, who was also the lead artist for two of my other favourite JRPGs, Bravely Default and Nier Automata, and Hitoshi Sakamoto as lead composer. So suffice to say, the producers of this game knew exactly what they were doing. In Vagrant Story, you play the role of Ashley Riot, a special forces knight with the most ridiculous hair you've ever seen, known as a risk breaker, as he chases down the Mullenkamp cult and their mysterious leader, Sidney Lostarrow, as they capture the son of the Duke Bardoba, who may or may not have machinations of his own. After facing off with Sidney in the Duke's manor and shooting him in the heart with a crossbow, Ashley mistakenly believes that he's won the fight, only to find Sidney get back up and knock him down, showing that he clearly is surviving things that he shouldn't. Ashley chases Sidney down to the forgotten city of Leomond and sets in motion a story of betrayal, social hierarchy, political gain, magic, and monsters. The story of Vagrant Story is shockingly tragic, full of really effective plot twists and turns. Even for the era of the PS1, we're talking Final Fantasy VII Metal Gear Solid terms here, with strong development from even the smallest characters and imagery that easily sticks with the player long after the credits roll. The deep and political tones of Matsuno's writing is very apparent and effective in this game, much like that of Final Fantasy Tactics before it. I actually read an article fairly recently from 2021 talking about Vagrant Story's use of the Rashomon effect, a writing method taken from the 1950 movie Rashomon, in which an event is given contradictory interpretations by the characters involved to give the consumer multiple ways to interpret what should be a complete story. Without going into spoilers, and I'm not going to go into spoilers because even though this game is really quite old by this point, I really do think that people should explore this game. It's a masterful weave of narrative that few games since have been able to replicate. Now, Vagrant Story may not look like much by today's standards, but at the time of its release in the year 2000, it was the absolute pinnacle of visuals for the PS1's visual fidelity and capabilities, and it pushed that console to its absolute limit, with detailed character models, a wide array of locations, and a huge number of different weapons on offer. In fact, the weapon crafting system was massively lauded at the time, giving full customization of both armor and weapons to be tailored to the player's needs, melding a blade, a hilt, and a gem, or dismantling found weapons for those same components, all of which have different capabilities for tackling different types of monsters, both different types and elements, to craft the perfect weapon for the next situation, and potentially make something new and more powerful entirely. Vagrant Story also boasted an extremely unique style of combat for its time, in which you would freeze a real-time fight to target the body parts within range of various enemies, and basically having different effects depending on the target of where you were hitting. So like if you broke an enemy's arm, they would deal less damage to you. If you broke an enemy's leg, it would move more slowly. And when you targeted those body parts, you would start a rhythm mini game of sorts where you'd be able to chain attacks together and then get stronger for each one you successfully pull off, but adding risk points to Ashley, making his attacks less accurate as he fights and loses concentration until he can successfully defend against enemy attacks for a while to allow his risk to drop back down again. So there was nothing really like this at the time, or honestly really even ever since. It's turn-based, but it's not. It was really intricate and kind of weird at the time, but very, very effective. And the massive variety of enemies and bosses, combined with varying weaknesses, as I said, both elemental and physical affinities, made it so that you were always having to think on your toes and weigh up your options in every fight you came across. So earlier I said is not a Final Fantasy game, and it's not. It's kind of one. As a matter of fact, for those of you who may not know, or maybe more recent to my channel, I actually worked at Square Enix myself for a while a few years ago, and one of the first questions I asked when I was there to some of my colleagues was whether Vagrant Story was retroactively considered a Final Fantasy game or not. It's not. But it is considered part of the Ivalice Alliance alongside Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, so it's easy to kind of think that it might be. So Le Monde is set in a distant time Ivalice where magic has become myth, so it bears a relationship in a similar vein to that of Drakengard and yeah, a continuation and labour of love for the writers, as the writers never originally intended for it to be seen as an Evolution title, and it was meant to be seen as fan service, but retroactively they've kind of gone, actually no, we quite like this, we're going to let it stick. While Vagrant Story has never had a sequel nor a remaster, which is a crying shame by the way, its presence permeates other JRPGs from Square Enix, showing that its influence is still felt to this day. The final boss music from Vagrant Story is used in Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood when fighting Thunder God Cid in the Auburn Monastery raid, which makes sense given that it's Ivalice based, and references made to Risk Breakers, Le Monde itself are made in multiple other games, so it's very clear that the developers at Square Enix have a soft spot and an admiration for Vagrant Story. And game developers aren't the only admirers of Vagrant Story. Media outlets at the time absolutely sang this game's praises, with numerous top scores and reviews, one of the few games to receive the top score of 40 from the long-running Famitsu magazine, and even now still holds a rating of 92 on Metacritic all these years later, with reviewers celebrating its storytelling, visual styles, and unique gameplay. Basically all the things I'm sitting here gushing over it for. In fact, it's rated as one of the best PS1 titles ever made, up there with the likes of Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, Gran Turismo, and of course Final Fantasy's Golden Age. So why is it that it isn't spoken about more by the masses or even known about by players of this day and age? I personally believe that it's due to a few reasons. Vagrant Story is quite punishing to people who don't already know about its intricate gameplay. To be real with you, how I played this game as a 12-year-old, I do not know. The block puzzles in this game, while engaging back then, are likely seen as unnecessary by today's standards. Vagrant Story may well have pushed the PS1 to its limits back in the day, but it doesn't quite carry the same sense of spectacle as, say, Final Fantasy VII. The visual splendor in this game is a little more nuanced. It's not quite as in your face as it is with those games, so maybe it's a factor as to why it's kind of been forgotten. The combat can be pretty overwhelming to new players, requiring the player to craft multiple weapons for different situations and enemy types, and swapping them in and out was probably considered a chore by many players. And if we ever were to see a remaster or something like that for Vagrant Story, this would be one of the first things that I addressed. I love this game, but it is by no means perfect. While Vagrant Story did sell pretty well when it released back in 2000, the year 2000 was a big game for JRPGs, and Vagrant Story was likely eclipsed by some of its JRPG brethren like Final Fantasy IX and Chrono Cross, which were both released in the same year. So it's likely that Vagrant Story just wasn't talked about as much as those titles, given the names that they bear and the Final Fantasy and Chrono names being as big as they are, and the butterfly effect of that has trickled down into today's age where people, even JRPG fans, have never even heard of it. Being released in 2000, that would also have been the tail end of the PS1's life cycle and the dawn of the PS2, which probably didn't help its case either. But as someone who couldn't afford a PS2 when it came out, and I randomly stumbled across Vagrant Story pre-owned back in my local game shop back as a 12-year-old, I'm really glad that that was the case, because it's still to this day one of my favourite games ever made, and that's why I've made this video, because I want to praise this game and I want more people to know about it. For the longest time, I've always said that I didn't want to see Vagrant Story remade because I felt that it would have been really easy for its nuance to be lost in translation, much like a movie adaptation of my favourite book. I've often felt like that about remakes in general for a really long time, but as time goes on and remakes like the Resident Evil games or Final Fantasy VII Remake come to the fray, can prove that strong remakes can be done. don't start with me over FF7. I know what it is, alright? I've played it enough to know that there's an argument as to whether it's a remake or not. For the argument's sake, I'm calling it a remake. Now, I believe that Vagrant Story should be remade, or at least remastered with some quality of life changes, simply because I believe Vagrant Story to be one of the best JRPGs ever made, period. And it is a crying shame that so few people in this day and age have been able to experience this game as I once did as a child. In hindsight, Vagrant Story actually really isn't a game a 12-year-old should be playing, but hey, here we are. The maturity of its content, both in its story and the way that it plays, would do so well with a modern audience that understands these things better if it was refined properly. And more people would get to see why there's so much more to Ashley Riot than being that JRPG guy with the ridiculous hair. His hair is legendarily ridiculous though, and it's clear that lead developers take a lot of inspiration from this game, so I'm sure that it would get the love it truly deserves should a project like that be greenlit. I could honestly sit and talk about Vagrant Story for hours upon hours. I haven't even touched on how it handles New Game Plus so well for its time, the iconography that's present in the game. I literally have the Blood Sin tattoo from Vagrant Story on my back, or why I love the characters in this game so much. So perhaps if you guys respond to this video, maybe I'll do a deep dive into some of the characters from Vagrant Story and why I adore them, because that would take a while to talk about. So realistically, this video goes out to all of my fellow Vagrant Story fans, as I am paying my due diligence to try and showcase this people to as many people as I can. Thank you ever so much for joining me today on this passion project of a video. If you want to see more JRPG content discussing Final Fantasy, other Square Enix games, and very well could be more videos on Vagrant Story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell for notifications for future videos so that I may spread the gospel of this game and tackle that dreaded YouTube algorithm. It's been kicking me in the butt for months now, and I could really do with a win here. Or if you would like to chat to me about Vagrant Story, or anything else really for that matter, please do come and find me over on Discord or Twitch through the links in the description box below. If perhaps you would like to support the channel further, like the wonderful people that you can see on the screen right now, perhaps consider joining the Patreon. As a full-time creator, it means everything that people support what I do, and I do my best to give back to those who support me with title cards like these that you see here, personal chats, and other benefits, so check out the link below if that interests you too. That's going to be all for today's video. I shall leave you with this final statement. Just go and play Vagrant Story, even if you find it's a little overwhelming or it's not for you given its age. You'll be playing a piece of JRPG history that inspires games well over 20 years after its release. Thank you again, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a great day, everyone. Take care. Bye.